I was sitting back there going through emails. Seriously. I got the reason for that. There was a reason. I've been in a men's Bible study for the last year or so that meets at 7 o'clock on Thursday mornings. So most weeks, unlike this past week when I forgot what day it was, and I was like, it was Friday, and I'm like, a Bible study. No, wait, it's Friday. I missed it, and then it was frustrating. So, but very interesting people, and I only know one of them, the person who invited me, and it's been a Zoom study since I've been part of it. So, people I don't know and have never met, and probably will never meet them. But now I know them. I don't know them, but I know them. So it's kind of a strange thing. But this Jim sent an email out. It's the one I was looking for earlier. And this was on Monday this week. He said, so I love music. Here are 4 that could represent 4 types of prayer: supplication, adoration, thanksgiving, contemplation. And a couple of these songs aren't they're James Taylor and B.J. So they're not necessarily songs you would sing in church. Well, it's really, now this was on Monday. So the one for Thanksgiving was, "What a Difference You've Made in My Life," which we sang last Sunday in church. It's like, okay, there's 2 people who kind of thought, maybe, even though it never mentions God, it's very clear that it could be a worship song. So sometimes you don't know when people write songs, especially in the secular arena, if they have a hidden agenda.
That was by B.J. Thomas.
Yeah, B.J. Thomas. Yeah, he was a Christian. So maybe he had, what a difference you've made in my life. Yeah, this is Memorial Weekend. Lois mentioned it's always kind of we think of who would have been our son-in-law who died. He was 22 when he died in Afghanistan. And so we always think of him and what he went through. And as far as we know, he loved these. He would talk about the little kids there in Afghanistan, and before he died, he really had a heart for the families who were suffering there in that war, who had nothing to do with any of what was going on other than being victims of war. So why do Christians suffer? Why do Christians suffer? That's what many of the people we've talked about this morning so far as prayer requests are wondering that. It's a little village, Miango, Nigeria. There's a guest house there, and there's a little church, probably a little chapel. Well, it's called Kirk Chapel. So it's a little chapel behind this guest house. And behind the chapel is this little cemetery. And that's true of a lot of rural churches. They'll have cemeteries behind their churches. And this one's in Nigeria. There's 56 graves in this cemetery. And 33 of them are children of Christian missionaries. So more than half of the graves in this little cemetery are children of Christian missionaries. And they're from, here's Ethel Arnold, September 1st, 1928 to September 2nd. So, lived one day. Barbara Swanson, 1946 to 1952, was 6 years old. Eileen Whitmoyer, 1952 to 1955, 3 years old. You know, these little children living in this difficult environment where their parents have been called in the mission field and have accepted the call. How many people are called and don't go? But that was the cost of taking the gospel to Nigeria for these missionary families. Well, there was a man named Charles White, and he visited this graveyard. And he said the only way we can understand the graveyard at Miango is to remember that God also buried his son on the mission field. I mean, that's a profound statement. And when he raised Jesus from the dead, he called the church to follow him into that same dangerous mission field called all the world. All the world. The dangerous mission field. And the question, of course, is, are we willing? Are we willing to do that? Now, everyone isn't called to Nigeria, or everyone isn't called to the Middle East. We're not necessarily called to places that we deem as dangerous, but we're called to here. You know, are we willing to take stands? You know, are you willing to follow Jesus during the hard times and when things are dangerous and when you know there's going to be pain? Might be financial pain, may not be pain of death. It may be pain of status. It may be pain of business. It may be pain of suffering, and it might be death. You know, little by little we're seeing things here where it's not just our rights that are eroded, it's our faith that's being called into question. You know, you can't do that anymore. How many things could you just normally do 50 years ago? Some of you can remember 50 years ago when you could just normally do things. Now, you might be sued to do those things, and you would lose. So our passage this morning, Jean? 1296. Thank you. 1296. Jean, you got to pay attention here because, you know. Okay, 1296. It's 1 Peter. 1 Peter, 4th chapter. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. You don't have to live very long before you realize you can't avoid suffering in this life. It's just part of the deal. But through the Word of God, we can see how we can endure it. And there's probably all of us are suffering for one cause or another. If it isn't our own personal pain, it's the pain of our children, or the pain of our relatives, the pains of our friends. That, you know, how many of our prayer requests this morning were about the pains of our friends, pains of our relatives. But Peter wanted the church to be ready for what was coming. And, suffering is just our reality. It's just part of life. If you think it isn't, if you think you become a Christian to not have to suffer, then you read the wrong book. Because it's coming. And it says, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you. When it comes, not if. It's when. So when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. No, this is normal. It's just the normal way of being as a Christian. And three different kinds of suffering. There's common suffering, the things that everybody goes through. Jesus talking here says, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. It happens to everybody. It's just the state of affairs if you're alive. And we don't understand, why good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people and bad things. We don't understand a lot. All the derivations of that sentence, we don't get any of them. We can't figure it out as much as we try. We have these questions in the middle of, why is this happening to me? Don't bother asking that question. Because any why God gives you is like, really? That's why? Well, okay. So, Solomon said, in my vain life, I love that, in my vain life, in my self-centered life, in my totally narcissistic life, which would have been great, right? But that word didn't exist yet. In my vain life, I've seen everything. There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness. There's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Evil people, they just seem to live forever, and these really good guys, the good die yet. Well, that's baloney. But whenever somebody really good dies young, you hear that, and it's like, well, no, but it does happen, and you see it, and you try to figure that out. That doesn't make any sense. And Solomon was seeing that thousands of years ago. And things have changed so dramatically since then. No, they haven't. They're still the same. All over the world, people, they're dying of starvation and droughts and hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes and living in war zones like these, unfortunate people in the Ukraine, which is just sad to see what's going on there. And millions of people suffering from all kinds of diseases. Well, that's just the nature of a fallen world. And then there's the carnal suffering, and it's not spiritual. It's like, you did this, and here's the consequence. If you're a Christian and you think you can get away with that, I told you about the guy who didn't pay his taxes, and he had this whole, this, as far as I knew, pretty solid Christian, but he had this whole thing about why he shouldn't have to pay taxes, and it was in the Constitution, blah, blah, blah. And he went to jail. And, you do these things, and there are consequences, whether you're a Christian or not. And it's not spiritual. It's just this and this. It's a consequence. This happened, that happened. And then there's Christian suffering. Christians suffer all the time. We're not suddenly immune to pain and suffering because we're following Christ. We're probably a little more sensitive to it. And there may be a time in your life when you're following Christ where your problems intensify because you're following Christ. It would be easier if you didn't follow Christ. That's a temptation. We have a lot of examples. James was beheaded by Herod. Stephen was stoned to death, relatively young man. And why was he stoned to death? Because he was preaching the gospel. Paul, of course, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less 1, 39 lashes. Who else received 39 lashes? 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times, stoned with stones, by the way. 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day. And he goes on and on and on. All these things that happened because of the cause of Christ, because he was in ministry. He said, and apart from other things, he had all these things that happened to him, these physical things, but then he adds, apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. What keeps you up at night, Paul? Well, I worry about the churches. So, if he wasn't being shipwrecked or beat up or put in jail, this guy was a wreck. He was up at night worrying about the churches and praying for them, but he was worried. He was worried for these people because he knew what was coming, just like Peter did. They knew what was coming. The Center for the Study of Global Christianity, they study persecution around the world, and they estimate that on average about 90,000 Christians a year die for the cause of Christ. We just never hear about them. That's not a news story. Another Christian died in Nigeria. I get emails on these lists every day about persecution, about what's going on in Africa, about what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Asia. It's constant. In India, there are radical Hindus. In the Middle East, of course, there's radical Muslims, in Africa as well. And you never hear about it. But there are organizations that track these things, and it's a huge number of people every year. And, a lot of us have experienced suffering. Christians suffer the same thing as everyone else, having to bury babies and children, and marriages failing, and becoming widows and widowers, and we have to plan funerals like everyone else. Sometimes we lose jobs through no fault of our own. There's just a reduction in force, or, they just have to do a downsizing. They have all these wonderful names for you losing your job. And then they tell you not to take it personally. You're like, well, it kind of affects me personally, but okay, it won't be like I did a bad job, I'm just losing it. And some of us have rebellious kids. And we, like Paul, are up in the night worrying about them and hopefully praying for them too. And it affects us physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually. It's that constant pressure that Paul talks about. You're hurting and you're suffering, and maybe you just want to know why. You just want to know why. And I can't remember the guy's name who, Lois and I will try to remember things together. I don't know if you go through this, where do you remember that guy and you have all the description, you can remember the guy's friends, but you can't remember him. So, Roy Wisner. It was a miracle. That was a miracle. We came up with that. I think it was because of the sermon, But Roy had, I think, a 3-year-old daughter who died on the mission field, and I remember sitting with him once, and it was when I was chaplain at the children's hospital over here and was having a really hard time seeing kids die. And it happened because they would get traumas that would come in, and it's really sad drownings and all kinds of accidents and things, and you would see these kids die. And Roy, who had lost a 3-year-old daughter on the mission field in Zaire, I was sitting with him and saying, how hard this was to watch, and he said, well, the way you get through it is you don't ask why. If you're stuck on why, you're stuck, and you're not going to get unstuck. Because even if God gave you the reason, it wouldn't be good enough. Because what you want is, you want it to be back the way it was. And it's not going to happen. Reasons for suffering. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when His glory is revealed. Don't think that your suffering is something that surprised God. God, I don't know if you knew what happened, but let me update you. I know you're busy. Clearly you're not, involved with my life, or you wouldn't let this happen. We get into these kind of nonsensical transactions with God as if He's somehow our business partner, and He's too busy to be involved with us, and we just have to, I don't know if you saw the Post-it note that I left you. We get into this silly thinking that has nothing to do with how God is. There is no random accident. It has a purpose. When you experience suffering, it might seem that God's a million miles away, but God hasn't moved. God's the same God He's been, and He's right there with you. He's working on you. He's molding you. He's making you into what He would have you to be. Even in the midst of suffering, God's working out His purpose in your life. I had an aunt who once said, what did she say? I don't want to misquote her. She did die, so it's not like she's going to come back and be upset with me. But she said, teach somebody else something for a while. That was her prayer. I've had enough of this. I already got my degree. I don't need another degree in this. So I don't know what she was going through, but my mom shared that with me. Some reasons for Christian suffering. Suffering prepares us. And the ultimate reason the Christian suffers is to form a Christ-like character. He wants us to be like Him. Part of the sanctification process. It'll be part of our lives until we reach glory. This constant churning in our lives of trying to move us into a place that's more like Him, and to get us comfortable with that. Comfort through suffering. Wow, that's the book I will never write, but that would be a great title, wouldn't it? Comfort through suffering. Ooh, that would be compelling. You'd take that off the shelf. Suffering proves our faith. Back in 1 Peter, in the first chapter of 1 Peter, he said, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. There's a purpose for this. Even though you're grieved by various trials, Genuine faith is proved by adversities. Suffering proves our character and integrity. And then suffering purifies us. In the refining process that gold goes through, this raw gold, so impure gold, is placed in the fire. And then there's this intense heat, and it melts the metal. And when this happens, the impurities, the dross, comes to the top. And those impurities are skimmed off the top, and the result in the gold, it's more valuable than it was before it went into the furnace. And that's fiery trial. You're more valuable after the trial. When some of those impurities, some of those things that aren't quite like Christ get skimmed off. That sounds simple. That process of getting skimmed off is a tough process. They'll bring us closer to a more pure relationship with God. And then suffering protects us. Well, how does suffering protect us? Well, it protects us from our own pride. We see this in the life of the Apostle Paul. He says in 2 Corinthians, he asked the Lord to remove that thorn from his flesh. This thorn in his flesh was an instrument allowed by God to help him maintain a spirit of humility. Paul evidently really didn't have much to be humble about. He was always the smartest guy in the room, that guy. But he needed to be also the most humble guy in the room. And how did God go about creating him as a humble person? He gave him something to be humble about. Sometimes suffering comes so we won't be confident in our own abilities. It reminds us of how powerful and in control God is, and there are a lot of reasons God allows suffering in our lives, reasons we won't always get to know. But the ultimate reason is He can make us into what He would have us to be. I know I'm repeating myself, but that's kind of the point here, is you don't suffer once and then it's over. You suffer again and again and again and again, and God keeps making you more like Him, more humble, stronger in the faith. Rejoicing, something's coming my way, it's going to be tough, but we'll get through it. Someone said you can tell how strong a Christian is by what it takes to stop him. What does it take to stop you? Many times, Christians seem steadfast and unshakable and joyful and all these things, and then suffering comes their way and they just kind of fall apart. So suffering is part of our reality, and there's reasons for our suffering. And what about reactions? There's a lot of different reactions to suffering. Some run away, some get angry and resentful and blame God. That's where I go most of the time, just in case you're wondering, well, how does Wendell deal with this? I get angry and resentful and blame God, and I do it over and over, and I'm like, oh, gee, this gets old. And I'm sure God's feeling the same way. Wendell, let's see, what can I help you with now? What can I do to make you feel more patient? What can I do to get you to trust me a little bit more? What can I do? I think the opportunities are endless. It's not good news. It's like, oh, now what? I'm still impatient. Now what's it going to take to get me more patient? But some people are just steady under fire. And it's amazing. Peter says the proper reaction to suffering is to rejoice. All right. I wish I could say I've gotten there. Yeah, that's where I am. Not quite. So some rejoice when suffering comes. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Somebody makes fun of you, like, that's how it's supposed to be. I'm right in the middle of God's will on this. Very cool. How many of you are there, by the way? Just a show of hands, like, okay. Peter says, if you're persecuted for your faith, rejoice. We can rejoice because, why? God is with us. God is with us. He's promised never to leave us or forsake us. I say that in so many prayers, and I think I'm reminding myself when I say it. You're hearing it, but it's for me. Wendell, He's promised never to leave us or forsake us. We can rejoice because God has a plan for us. We can rejoice because, the benefits that suffering brings in our lives. We're becoming more and more like Him as time goes on. Charles Spurgeon said, they who dive in the sea of affliction bring up rare pearls. That was kind of a key word that I was missing there. Rare pearls. When you persevere in the midst of suffering, you grow in your faith. You grow in your faith. You'll know your faith is real. You'll realize God was with you all the way through the fire. You get out through the other end and you're like, the questions you start asking you is now, why did I make that so hard? Why did I make that so hard? Why did I worry my way through that whole thing when God had a plan? John MacArthur wrote, the more we rejoice in our testings, the more we realize that they are not liabilities but privileges, ultimately beneficial and not harmful, no matter how destructive and painful the immediate experience of them might appear, no matter how hard this is to go through. God has a plan for this. And there's those who react the opposite way. They rebel. They turn their back on God when they feel like God has let them down. I thought we had a deal here. You're not pulling your weight, God. That sounds horrible to say that. But think of how you deal with difficulties, and if you turn your back on God, even for a moment, because they're mad at God, they put their Bibles down, they stop praying, they don't go to church anymore, they deprive themselves of any kind of support from the Lord, and then they blame the Lord for it. Or should I say, we deprive ourselves from any blessing we can get from the Lord, and then we blame ourselves. It's always easier to say they. No longer under the preaching of the Word, can't lean on Christians, on brothers and sisters. We lean on each other a lot here, I think. Because we need to. We have each other. We're the best resource apart from Scripture. That's why the church exists, because it's really tough to get through. They miss out on verses like Romans 8. He who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purposes. If you believe that, you need to reread it anyway and understand that there's a purpose for this. And then 2 Corinthians, for this light momentarily affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Things we don't see, they have eternal consequences. They have eternal blessings. They're with us forever. Instead of turning to God, they turn from Him. And the sad thing is, we don't need to suffer alone. We don't need to suffer by ourselves when we don't, share our lives with other Christians. We kind of doom ourselves to suffer alone. You say, well, but I pray but God will direct you to other believers. And if you cut yourself off, you're doing yourself such a disservice. Then our reliance in suffering. Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. We entrust our souls to a Creator who's faithful. To entrust, the word is to deposit for safekeeping. It's a banking term, actually, which is, you put your money in the bank, and then you don't have to worry about it. It won't. These days, it won't grow necessarily, but at least it's safe there. But it's to deposit for safekeeping. That's what we do. We trust the Lord with our eternal lives. That part of us that will go on forever. There's this part of it won't go on forever. There's some point where we're going to get new bodies. Oh boy, I can't wait for that. I mean, I can give you a litany of my aches and pains, and about 1/10 of the way through, you're going to be bored. And it's just, but we're going to be getting new bodies. And then no matter what we face in this life, we must rely on our Father to walk with us. Stop trying to fix your own problems. Look to the one who won't necessarily fix it the way you want it fixed. It can't go back to the way it was. You're not going to get an answer to the why questions. It's kind of how it works. The refiner takes the metal and sits before the furnace, and he makes sure the fire's not too hot, because if it's too hot, that doesn't work. But hot enough to accomplish the purpose. And then he leaves the gold in the fire until, again, like I said earlier, the dross kind of floats to the top, the impurities, and they're removed. And how does he know that the gold is ready from the fire, ready to remove from the fire? And this is interesting. He sees his perfect reflection in its surface. That's the case for Jesus. He never leaves us alone in the fire. He's right there with us, and he's looking for his reflection in us. So, when will you be removed from the fire? That's the question, right? Isn't that the question we all have? And it's his reflection in you. Lord God, I thank you that you are extremely patient. And as you teach us patience and all these other things that we need to be effective witnesses for you, that you walk with us, that you direct us, that you guide us, that you are a constant source of hope and love and care, that you're always with us, that we don't need to look in any other direction but to you, and that you are everything that we need. And certainly, Lord, what a difference you've made in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.